Stanford.
That's awesome. Yeah.
My name is Elena Chris. I'm the Director of Policy and Society here at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. And I want to welcome you to the plenary sessions for the 2025 Congressional Boot Camp on AI. At HAI, we believe good policy starts with good understanding. Our work spans groundbreaking AI research, education programs that train the next generation of leaders, and partnerships that convene experts from academia, industry, government, and civil society. Our faculty and researchers represent all 7 schools here at Stanford, creating a truly multidisciplinary community that brings together computer science and engineering, law, medicine, education, business, sustainability, and the humanities and sciences. Since we launched HAI 6 years ago, we've had the privilege of training policymakers at every level, from state and local officials to federal and global leaders, helping them grapple with both the promise and the risk of AI. What makes this bootcamp unique is the combination of rigorous multidisciplinary content and the opportunity for participants to engage directly with the researchers and practitioners shaping the field. Over these 3 days, our bootcamp cohort is diving into AI fundamentals, exploring AI applications in key sectors, and grappling with the complex societal questions that it raises. Our plenary sessions build on that foundation, bringing our congressional staff into the conversation with leaders from across policy, industry, civil society, and the global AI community. For today's first session, we'll turn to the role of industry in shaping the field and how collaboration between the public and private sectors can help ensure AI advances in ways that serve the public good. With that, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists for today's session. I'll share them and then invite them to come up and take a seat. Alice Friend is the Global Head of AI and Emerging Technology Policy at Google. Sarah Guo is the Founder and Managing Partner at the venture firm Conviction. Matt Perault is the Head of AI Policy at Andreessen Horowitz. Navrina Singh is the Founder and CEO of CredoAI. And finally, guiding our conversation today is our moderator, Rohini Kosoglu, a policy fellow here at Stanford HAI. So please come up and join us.
We just go down again. Hello, everyone. I was just telling the group, let's have a fun Friday panel, and then I realized it's Tuesday. So, we're going to make sure to have fun, but I cannot promise that it is actually this day of the week. So we are here today because literally several years ago, it is a weird conversation to be having policymakers looking at what is the role of the business community in this space and how should we be thinking about it as a community, where are their partnerships, where are their challenges, where are their opportunities. So it's so exciting just in terms of the speakers that we have. But I think we all know in this room, for people that follow this, that it has been an exciting year just to have these conversations and debate about the different policy challenges and opportunities and what we can do as we contemplate the future of AI and the policy landscape. So here, this panel is here to hopefully give us a pulse check and make it fun. And I think I just want all of you to think about what are some of the ways that really this policy conversation has come up for you all in a way that has been unexpected and surprising. So first, I will turn to Navrina. At CredoAI, I know you guys are helping companies as they're thinking through internal guardrails. And what I think has been amazing is just how you've created this ecosystem for people to even have this conversation. So can you talk to us a little bit about how it got started, but also where are you seeing the different breakdowns or kind of pain points and people getting stuck at this?
Absolutely. Well, so great to be here. A little bit about CredoAI. We are an AI governance and trust platform. What that means is Global 2000s utilize our platform to do 3 things really well. One is alignment, which is what do you need to really measure in these diverse AI capabilities, whether you're trying to measure generative AI applications or agentic AI applications. And you'll be surprised how complex that problem is because so much of AI is context-based. So you might use the same foundation model for a marketing application versus an application for customer service. The things that you're going to measure in that drastically vary. So that alignment problem is a pretty big one that we try and solve for. The second is once you've aligned on what you need to measure, how do you actually go and measure it? And this is where robust evaluations become really critical. And there's a massive gap between everything that's happening in the AI ops ecosystem, in your data and AI tooling, and what's happening in your GRC ecosystem, the governance, risk, and compliance. And so we see our role as a really important, I would say, translator of what's happening in policy, standards, regulation, but also how you as a data scientist or an AI engineer can really codify and prove that you're doing the right things. And then the last thing is translation. There's, as you can see, that AI capabilities are on the rise literally day by day. The key question is, even if you get access to these metrics and you get access to these evaluations, you have an understanding of policy, how do you actually make sense of it? Because everyone is coming at it from very different expertise. Many of you here are coming from policy expertise, and we at CredoAI are AI experts. So we had to actually build a translation layer between these two ecosystems. So what has been really, I would say, exciting, especially in the recent times, is a much more deeper focus on scientific evaluations and robustness, but really bridging the gap between what does good look like for an enterprise to trust these systems.
Well, on that question of trust, I think it's one that a lot of policymakers are trying to grapple with. How do we debate this? How do we have this out? So I want to turn to you, Matt. You have been, I'm sure, up talking to policymakers at all hours of the day, given your job. Where do you feel like there's both been an education that's been helpful for them, but how you can build that trusting relationship when it comes to both the venture side and particularly as you think about AI?
Thanks so much for the question. It's great to be here. I think this is my first event at HAI. I hope it's not my last. It seems like a really amazing...
Depends on how you do.
We'll see. So the exciting thing for me about this job is the opportunity to see small tech companies up close. So my introduction into the tech ecosystem was in the public policy team at Facebook. And the time I joined Facebook, it was about 1,500 people or so, much smaller than the 50, 60, 70, 80,000 that it is today, but still, I think, not a startup. People sort of lusted off after the Mark Zuckerberg in the dorm room phase, but we were not at that point. After that, for the last 5 years, I was working in academia in tech centers at lesser institutions than this one, at Duke and UNC in North Carolina. And we wrote in a lot of the policy briefs that we did, we have a sense that some of the regulations that are being proposed would have significant implications for startups, but that was a thing that I did in typical academic fashion from remove. I didn't really have a direct experience with startups, and it was something that we were guessing at that we didn't really know. Andreessen Horowitz, the companies in our portfolio, many of them don't actually have a policy equivalent to me, which has actually made this job really interesting and exciting, and also sort of frustrating at times because there's not even a general counsel for me to talk to or a head of policy. These are small teams working really hard to try to get products to market. And a lot of the policy proposals that we've seen so far have been proposals that I think would make it really hard for these companies to compete. We have like strong AI companies who are on this panel today. If you are a startup, if you are a founder and a couple of engineers and you're trying to compete with a company like Google and AI, that is an incredibly hard uphill battle. It's incredibly, incredibly difficult. A lot of the regulatory proposals that we've seen have been things that have been focused on development. So they've been focused on adding various different assurance processes to the development experience. So in order to build a model, you have to do X, Y, Z. And for larger companies, that would be, I think, significantly easier for them. Those would be compliance costs that would be easier for them to bear than for smaller companies. When I left Facebook, the policy team was about 600. The legal team, I assume, was about 2 or 3 times that. Those companies could put entire teams to work to comply with regimes like we have in Europe, or some of the state proposals that we've seen, or some of the federal proposals that we've seen. Smaller companies don't have that luxury. And so I think that's the primary thing that we've been trying to educate policymakers about. The next question, obviously, is, well, if development-oriented regulation isn't really workable for startups, then what regulatory frameworks would work? And almost everyone who looks at our firm thinks that our view of the right policy agenda is that there is none, that it be entirely deregulatory. That's not actually the case. And that's not the case because our firm, the funds that are in our firm have 10-year life cycles. So if you see an AI market that it spikes tomorrow, and then 2 years from now it crashes because people think the technology is unsafe, it doesn't work for them, it's a bad user experience, it's not good for society, that's not going to result in an economic return that's good for our investors or good for us. So really what we're focused on is trying to encourage regulators to focus on regulating harmful use, so punishing the harmful use of the technology, which we think is something that startups can comply with, as opposed to putting the emphasis on the development process.
Yeah, I think you've given us a lot to think about. I also want to say that we're going to have time for question and answer. So start thinking of some, but I think that was a lot of really good points just from the startup community. And I can't even imagine when they don't have any general counsel yet, which I'm now thinking about what those kind of conversations are. So Alice, to go to you. So there's been a lot of people here also on the other side of the coin, very interested in AI and infrastructure. There's been a lot of talk about data centers, all different types of issues, public computing with the NAIR and all of those things. What do you feel like are some points that policymakers that you find yourself having to really actually get in there and educate people on?
Well, thank you, Rohini, for the question, for hosting us all today. Welcome everyone to California, especially if this is your first time. I grew up right around the corner on the other side of the golf course from here, and used to sell golf balls back to some of the golfers as a kid. So really excited to have you all here. From our perspective, I think the thing that we are really focused on is the economic opportunity that AI poses for the United States and for the world. By some estimates, by 2030, there could be $4 trillion of additional GDP growth on the table for the United States. And a lot of that relies on smart and sustainable infrastructure investment, right? And so, we put our money where our mouth is. $85 billion in CapEx is what we anticipate alone spending in 2025. And that's just, one of the companies in the United States that think that AI really is the future. So if we're going to do that, though, it's not enough just to build data centers. You also need to power the data centers. So a lot of what we've been focusing on at Google is working with policymakers about how do we have our energy infrastructure and our energy supply keep up with that increase in demand that we know is already happening and is coming, right? And how do we get creative about that? How do we ensure that we are diversifying the energy supply portfolio? And what do we need to do in order to meet that demand on time? One thing we know is that there are a lot of policy challenges in addition to just sort of the physical infrastructure challenges across the United States. And so I think we're excited about, we've seen a lot of appreciation and understanding of this really practical portion of the investment in AI across the states and also at the federal level. I'm sure there are folks in the room here who work on this issue on the Hill that know more about it than I do. But I think from our perspective, really laying in that foundation for being able to capitalize on AI's benefits for years to come is what we are really focused on. And we also recognize that it's something that one company can't do alone and needs to work in partnership with governments, with other companies, and again, think really creatively about transmission, about how do we add net supply as opposed to being a net drain on supply? How do we continue to put our shoulder into clean energy? How do we think about bringing online geothermal, nuclear, in addition to more traditional sources of energy? We just have to get really busy as a country in making these investments and doing these build outs if we're going to be able to actually power this AI future.
That's a number of good points, and I'm sure that a lot of people are going to have some really interesting questions about, particularly around the energy demands and what we have in store as the companies are thinking through this with having to fund a ton of money behind it. So Sarah, just to turn to you, you have the unique perspective of looking at a ton of companies and thinking about their future in the AI ecosystem and trying to sort of pick what'll be winners and hopefully pass on the losers. But why don't you talk to us? It would be great to hear your perspective on just what you're seeing and things that may come up as a potential like this is not the way to do business, and where you see like real opportunities amongst the companies you're seeing.
When you say this is not the way to do business, do you mean like harmful use, or do you mean?
No, not harmful. I just mean like transformational versus not incremental, because a lot of people in this room are, I think, trying to work through how do we move incentives towards the right direction? And sort of what is the advice you're giving these companies, ones that are missing the better use cases than others?
Yes. Okay, great. First, thank you for having me back here. HAI is a great organization, and I think it's a very valuable effort. So as you mentioned, like we invest up and down the stack at Conviction. The fund was started a few years ago upon the premise that this is a transformational general technology. It will reshape a number of industries, and like the businesses that are competitive over the next decade, and something that I care deeply about, like the productivity gains and abundance you can create, are quite different, right? And so that's sort of the mission statement of the firm. And I do think that the early winners in AI, they look quite different than the last generation of software companies. Like a lot of them don't look quite like software companies at all. And so I can give a few examples. The first investment in our fund was a company called Harvey. They are now, not Google, but past 100 million of ARR a few years into their lifespan. And they automate a lot of the toil of low-level paralegal and first-year associate legal work. And so they've been adopted by a number of corporates and white shoe law firms at this point. The company's growing very quickly. And if you had asked me, am I interested in vertical legal software? Like, let's be honest, like 5 years ago, probably not. Right. But like the interest in Harvey and the ability to increase productivity per unit of labor for professional services that are highly specialized, like the law, is very interesting, right? Like, can we do better legal work with less effort? I think it's very possible. And so, there are a number of verticals that have been slower technology adopters or very labor intensive, where like, I went to Penn. If you like go to school and you study law at Penn, like the thing you don't want to do is probably spend 200 hours like looking through documents for like a rephrasing of a clause with a period out of place. But models are actually very good at this. The thing you probably want to do is think about like the strategic risk for your client of like this particular motion you want to make. And so I think that up leveling is very interesting, and the framing of like the importance of certain verticals is not as important now, because you can just do more for the end user. Another thing that is of high interest to us is I'm sure you guys have seen, like there's a chart of output per dollar, or how much it costs to get a particular service in the United States for different goods, right? So think like, for purchasing power, what does it cost to have a car or a TV or a unit of healthcare or education? And healthcare and education are the two areas where like productivity has just not improved overall for a very long time. And like that seems abhorrent, right? They're very important to us as a society. And so I've been working on, healthcare technology for a decade now, but I'm more optimistic than ever. We have a portfolio company called Open Evidence. Half the doctors and nurses in the United States use this with the average using it every day now. And the company has released the product over the last 2 years, right? And so I've never seen such a pace of adoption in healthcare. It allows you to do clinical reasoning on recent medical research on specialized cases, and it retrieves only from like medical journals that are peer reviewed and like have a layer of reliability around them, right? And so when you think about the opportunity to increase the productivity and accessibility of these high level services to more Americans, like I think that is actually like both really interesting and economically valuable when people are trying to do the same thing that Google or OpenAI or whatever is trying to do as their core product, with like an incremental feature improvement or something the next version of the model will solve. Like it's not a great path, as you said. Bad plan.
Got it. That's very interesting. So because we have so many people that work for lawmakers, some of them will be future lawmakers, it would be really great to hear just where you really feel like I'm sure a number of you are talking to policymakers, lawmakers all the time. Like, where do you feel like they need to get this? And you're like, I have this one takeaway and I just want to leave you with X. What would you say that is?
Anyone? Oh, great. So, it's interesting. Before I answer that question, as a venture-backed startup, we are in the business of making sure that startups like Harvey can actually sell into bigger enterprises, and bigger enterprises actually understand how to very quickly evaluate these systems. So I would say that one key takeaway that I would propose for the policymakers is really like using governance as an enabler for innovation. Because as an example, SOC 2, how many of you know what SOC 2 is? Great, awesome. So for those who don't know, SOC 2 actually is a really interesting standard that has core cybersecurity practices built into it, core reliability practices built into it. And SOC 2 is a standard that is adopted by a lot of startups like us, because that helps us sell faster into a JP Morgan and Chase. It helps us sell faster into MasterCard, et cetera. And so I think one of the things that we are finding in AI is there's a lack of SOC 2 for AI standard. And I think the policymakers who understand that that standard can be created based on context of use, I think that's how we are going to win, and that it actually enables innovation. So to Matt's point, where if compliance is a barrier for startups, I actually believe that governance is also an accelerant for innovation, because a lot of these startups, if they are matching to these standards that are getting created by policymakers, which are context specific, use case specific, we as a startup can actually sell faster. We can actually enable faster innovation, because now we are actually showing up in Global 2000s much faster. So I would say that's the key takeaway for the policymakers, is governance is truly an enabler when it is context and use case focused.
Done right. Yep.
I've just been obsessing for the last few minutes about the $100 million Harvey revenue number. So
Yeah.
how, because I'm thinking about, doing a lot of thinking now about like what is big and what's small. So how many people in the room had heard of Harvey before Sarah mentioned them?
Oh,
like,
nice.
That's pretty good. How big is Harvey?
How many of you are lawyers?
Okay.
How many employees is roughly?
A bit over 200.
Okay, so I don't know if people in the room would think of that as little tech or mid tech or big tech, but that 100 million is the revenue threshold that's included in the new California proposal for AI governance, and that's the cutoff between large and small.
Okay. We do not think of ourselves as a large company, for what it's worth. Yes.
So there you go. So I think the revenue threshold in the California legislation deserves, I think, first to be applauded, because it's a revenue threshold, which means it's focused on the thing that I think is most relevant for whether a firm can bear compliance costs, which is how much money are you bringing in.
Yeah.
And at some point, whatever the number is, you should be devoting some portion of that revenue to compliance, or toward building out your legal team, or building out your safety team, or your policy team. I think that's the only piece of legislation that we've seen that's really actively moving that has included a revenue threshold. The typical thresholds in AI are training cost thresholds, which I think are not, which tend to capture the development phase. Like, in order to build an AI tool, you need to bring in a lot of money, and then you need to devote it to training. I was trying to understand, like, when did OpenAI hit the $100 million training cost threshold? And it had $100 million on day one. So, which it didn't spend immediately on training costs, but like the idea when OpenAI started in, I don't know if anyone knows, 2017 maybe, when it started was that they were going to need an enormous amount of money just to build AI models. So training cost thresholds, I think, are not particularly effective, because they are going to capture startups that are building at the frontier, trying to compete with the Googles and OpenAIs. The other threshold that's often used is there are FLOSS thresholds, which are like essentially a proxy for power, which also would capture like an OpenAI on day one that's trying to compete at the frontier. We want the frontier to be a place where there's a lot of competition. That's not just like a small handful of companies. So revenue better than training, at least from our perspective, better than compute costs, better than FLOSS thresholds. But then there is the question of what's the right revenue threshold. And my sense is that $100 million as even though that sounds like a large number, still captures a set of companies that you're wanting them to focus on devoting as much energy as possible to adding competition to the frontier, as opposed to diverting some of those resources to compliance.
Rohini, can I jump in here? Because I think I'm gonna focus us in a different area, which is just that I think a lot of the time I spent 20 years in Washington. I have a national security background, but I was in the executive branch, sort of in receipt of laws and regulations. And I have a lot of sympathy for trying to regulate something that is a general purpose technology like AI that seems like it's everywhere, and wanting to be able to do it in a way that sort of gets at everything at one time, right? So I think we talk a lot about regulating inputs. We talk a lot about regulating models and data and understanding how we're training these things, right? And we talk a lot less about the outputs and outcomes side in the regulatory sense, which has always puzzled me because most existing regulations really are about putting constraints on the possible outcomes, knowing what an unsafe result is, and then having a legal structure that disincentivizes that result from obtaining. And so you as an engineer will know, okay, the system I put out on the market can't do X, right? There is a legal limit to that, or there is a regulatory limit to that. And I am reporting out or aiming for that constraint. And I would argue that, if we're really worried about AI safety and about, consumer safety, then we should really be shifting our focus to those outcomes and those outputs that we do not want to see obtained in the world so that we can realize all these benefits. And so that we can continue to innovate. And the thing I worry about when we sort of talk about, well, let's kind of look at the firm size or the firm revenue, or let's look at the models, or let's look at sort of, how are these things being built and designed, is that it's trying to have regulation keep up with a technology that's still early days in development. And you're sort of asking to be an anachronistic regulation almost from the get-go. And on top of it, not even be squarely looking at those outcomes you want to prevent. You're hoping that you're going to prevent all those outcomes by being way upstream. And I think it feels logically intuitive, but it actually doesn't make a lot of sense for a general purpose technology. Just a very long way of answering your question, but that's the thing. I'm always trying to talk to policymakers about.
They're both. I mean, I think they're both. I literally think people in this room are trying to work through some of those same questions with a lot of you in this group, so including myself. So I think that that's incredibly helpful. And these debates are what we need to keep having, because it's, Sarah, to your point, all these different use cases are what sort of makes us better understand, okay, these are the real world impacts of this, and do we have an ecosystem to begin with? But to you, do you have any comments on that?
I've never before, so I spent a decade as an investor before I started Conviction, and I've never had a policy agenda before, but now I do. Right? And I think, jokes aside, it is we care about competitiveness, safety, innovation, and national security. And I think AI is very, again, biased. It's very important technology and it has very broad ramifications. But we want to see competitiveness in terms of, I think there are many complications around these model companies. I think most people are glad Google and OpenAI are American companies versus, those of our adversaries. From a innovation perspective, there is a lot of imported talent in the United States. This is a very global competition. And I think that the benefits of owning the companies and the tools and the models that will have a lot of influence and ability to create productivity in the future, I think it's pretty clear that there are benefits for America if there's diversity of competition and that the people building the leading edge are here, right? I do think that it is, I don't want to make this especially about national security, but I sit on the board of an electronic warfare company today, and I do think that, technology progression and using AI for things like drone detection is going to be increasingly important. And then we think about abuse, right? About harmful use. And I would agree with what has been said here in that there's a lot of focus on the development phase. But if you believe, as we do, it's a general purpose technology with use cases for consumers, from knowledge to companionship, for lawyers, for doctors, for education, then for the pharma industry, we should probably go worry about all of those things. And I think it's going to happen pretty quickly. And so my overall view is there are lots of benefits here. Some of the concerns are real. I think that from a cyber perspective, you are going to see a lot of acceleration in capability from attackers, as we probably need to be ready to defend against that. But along all of these dimensions, I think everybody here has a big job in front of them in terms of thinking about outcomes as they arrive pretty quickly.
Where I know that a lot of you have actually you're part of companies that have had a pretty strong partnership with a lot of different people in academia and that talent and those resources. And obviously, one of the big discussions that I think a lot of policymakers go through is, how to fund, where to fund, academia, non-academia, industry partnerships, and such. What are your thoughts on sort of the role in this? I mean, obviously, I'm biased, and a bunch of people that work here are, but really, I mean, in terms of the NAIR and all of the things that we need, just to Sarah, to your point about keeping competitive against other countries and adversaries. Do any of you have thoughts on that piece?
I can start. We actually do a lot of work with MIT, Stanford, and others, but I think there's such a huge role, especially for a startup like ours and academia. As an example, independent evaluations of these large language models. Obviously, everyone in the industry right now is obsessed with benchmarks. The problem with those benchmarks are they're so static. So something that we've been actively thinking about and working on is context-aware benchmarks, which are really all about within, again, the output or the use of that particular foundation system. How do you actually measure what model can actually do better versus not? And I think that's a place that we have seen academia and private sector work really well in creating these independent evaluation benchmarks, which are context aware. And then the second thing, Stanford has done an amazing job with Helm, which is a great way to, again, benchmark some of these new frontier models that are coming out. So I think having, again, that independence and evaluation, at least for us, really works well. The other area, I think the question around harms and, the different kinds of harms, I think there's a big need right now for independent red teaming. And we are actually seeing some great work come out of MIT, for example, the AI risk repository. They are tracking about 1,600 risks. We've codified 600 of those risks within our platform. But the key question is, how do you actually, once you understand that risk, how do you go about mitigating that risk? And I don't think it's just, going back to, I think, a comment that Alice made, that it's not one company that can deal with all this. It needs an ecosystem of players. And we are strong believers that it doesn't just need startups like ours. It needs investors. It needs companies like Google, but it absolutely needs academia, where there's a lot of brain power that resides to do these independent evaluations and hopefully in future standard setting as well.
So I have two thoughts. So one is actionable concrete policy frameworks from academia for government. So I sort of lived this a bit when I was at Meta. If we had a policy idea and we put it out in the ecosystem as our policy idea, that meant that it would be hated. That was the best way to get an idea trashed, was for us to put it out. So
you said it. None of us said it.
My job was to find good policy ideas, and so I went looking out in the ecosystem for not sort of theoretical examinations of something, or not a list of all the things that were problematic about Facebook, but how to make the social media ecosystem better in a way that was good for consumers and didn't kill innovation. And there were academia was not producing a lot of those. And so when I started running a tech policy center first at Duke and then at UNC, that was really what I tried to do. Not why is this such a hard problem? And we weren't very good or elegant. We didn't create elegant problem statements. We tried to do the work of coming up with generally not very sexy and often heavily critiqued ideas for what the people in this room can do when they have a blank sheet of paper and they're trying to craft a policy proposal on something. I think maybe academia is in a better spot with that than they were 5 or 10 years ago, but I still think there's a lot of room, and particularly in AI and particularly in the current moment, where I think we really need good ideas. The second is empirical work to evaluate the impact of public policy after it's been enacted, which I think is just shockingly flimsy. It's really bizarre. I just read Jen Palka's book, Recoding America, which is fabulous. And she has all this stuff about the impact of GDPR, which is super fascinating. She has this great line, paperwork favors the powerful. And she cites a study about the impact of GDPR in Europe, which is often cited, depending on the audience, I guess it's cited for killing off innovation, but is also cited as the thing that we need in America. Europe's got privacy rules. We don't have that in the United States. We need it in the United States. And the statistics in this study, and this is not the last word, but was that in the abstract for the study, it says large tech companies were unaffected by GDPR. That's the conclusion. And then they go on into revenue numbers. And I think the revenue number for big tech was somewhere in the like 4.5% to 5% range of negative impact on revenue. And for small tech companies, it was like triple, like 13% or something like that. And that's not like, that is an assessment of cost. There might be any number of benefits that should also be taken into account. I don't think that the purpose of that study is to show that GDPR is bad. But if you're mainly, there are people who push privacy legislation and push competitiveness at the same time, and there are tensions between those policy frameworks. And if we don't have academics measuring the impacts of public policy, then it's really hard to know what works and what doesn't. And I have just been shocked at like the limited amount of academic research that's going into like, okay, the state just did this thing, what's the impact? Or this nation just did this thing, the EU just did this thing, what's the impact? What can we learn? How can we extract lessons from that into the next policy debate?
Yeah, I mean, I'll add like the obvious thing that I will just say out loud is that, of course, in AI as a technology, an enormous amount of the fundamental research in AI comes out of universities. A lot of it comes out of Stanford, but other universities as well. We were talking about your new robotics lab in the green room, and you know the joke at Google is that like everything that's cool in robotics at Google like got invented at Stanford. And then they came over and like, you know, kept tinkering on it. And we have a lot of folks that, you know, came out of Stanford as PhDs and so forth. So I think the knowledge sort of exchange and the way that, you know, universities in the United States really continue to be the engine of innovation is really important to highlight. I'm a social scientist. So I also just want to shout out, I think, aligning with what Matt was saying, there are a lot of folks in academia that are able to take this independent view of, you know, what do we think the social impacts of AI will be, right? And I think a huge one that we all talk about a lot is workforce impacts. And there are a lot of heroic claims out in the ecosystem right now, but the truth is it's very early days for data and for the research. And so I find the folks largely at MIT and here, Eric Brynjolfsson here, are doing real rigorous empirical work on, you know, what will the impacts be? How will we know? How can we predict it? How can we use historical patterns and project them into the future with AI? Is that a valid method, et cetera, right? It's really important too that, you know, those voices continue to add to our collective social understanding of this technology.
I'm laughing because I missed the robots in the green room conversation, but one of our portfolio companies is to Stanford robotics PhD dropouts who worked at DeepMind. So I'm like, oh, that rings true. I think we have the, you know, leading robotics model right now. So I actually agree with a lot of what's been said. To add to Alice's point, I think, you know, maybe first on that is universities and academia, like academic institutions like Stanford have uniquely independent credibility, right? And that matters for policy making, that matters for like measuring impact of policy, matters for measuring impact of products and companies, and then also like overall societal understanding. I think that these changes are happening very quickly right now. And without information on how jobs are changing, who's benefiting from productivity impacts, if there are productivity impacts, how it changes behavior in terms of how people understand information, people are going to make a lot of assumptions, right? And then policies will be made based on those assumptions. And so I think there's very foundational understanding work that academic institutions have the credibility to do independently. So I strongly agree with that. Maybe the additional thing I'd say is like, we probably have like 10 founders from not a very large portfolio that are Stanford folks in different ways. And existing companies, like they only have so much bandwidth, even the most ambitious ones like Google and OpenAI and like the big companies, right? But there are a lot of problems that are worth solving and studying with AI. And I think like the academic setting allows people to express creativity with constraint instead of on an industrial mission, right? Where you're like, oh, well, you know, should we turn up GPUs to 50,000 for this particular research bet? I think that probably doesn't leave as much focus for example, I sit on the board of a company called Latent Health, They automate parts of healthcare administration, particularly like getting people specialty pharma treatments faster. One of the founders worked in Feifei's lab here as a research scientist. That's not part of like the core super intelligence mission of some of these large companies, but also seems really worth doing. And so I think that the academic setting allows like very talented people to explore worthwhile problems without being herded into like a particular economic mission early. And I'm somebody who believes in economic missions as a venture capitalist, but I think that is like an amazing environment that we need to continue to sustain.
Great. I did not say Stanford. I said academia, but that.
Stanford.
I just wanted to point it out. So, I did not say anything else in the green room other than the robotics piece. So as not to bias the panelists. Question and answer time. So hands up if anybody has a question of these amazing panelists.
So, focus to national security.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Isiro Mem. I'm the founder of MetroSite, and I'm here representing ADP, which is a client of ours. I want to shift attention back to national security. So there's this notion, in surfacing around that there's the potential for AI to confer winner-takes-all type military capabilities if it goes far enough. And I'm wondering if industry is being proactive in ways that perhaps might be more expected of a government. Like, does anybody require security clearance of people who work on Gemini at Google, for example?
I think that was to me.
So,
I think I said earlier, I have a national security background. One of the things that drew me to Google was that it takes responsibility in AI really seriously, including in security, including in cybersecurity, but also security of our models, security of our labs, et cetera. A security clearance is something the federal government gives you when you work for them or work for a contractor that gets security clearances. And I am not sort of in the sort of cloud Google public sector realm, so I don't want to say something that's not right. So that wouldn't be our model though, right? It would be more about, how do we secure our own facilities and our own personnel, right? But it is something we take very seriously and we think about a lot. I think, sort of zooming back out and connecting to this academic conversation, what's so important about that too is, if we're talking about a fundamental scientific and engineering set of challenges, and then we're also talking about the social science of, what are the impacts of this general purpose technology on our economies, on our, societies, on every sector, every domain. Then we're having a conversation about openness and information. And so I think, if we're going to talk about who's going to innovate faster, and is there a winner take all, I think that's really debatable. I think I'm going to borrow this line from a friend of mine that he always says he's not really worried about the US being out innovated per se. He's much more worried about the US being out adopted. How you deploy the technology is going to matter probably more than if you have the biggest model or the most maxed out capable model that has AGI. If you're not sort of using it well, then it doesn't really matter. But I think all of these conversations are about balancing, how do we all work on this together and how do we keep it safe and secure? And I think we're just at the beginning of having those debates. And as somebody that has worked in classified environments and now works in the private sector and also was in academia for a while, I think it's really important for us to sort of take into consideration, how do we make environments where the right people can be thinking about these problems and can be exchanging the information they need to exchange? And that, that to my mind is a different issue set than sort of, this is TSSCI, this very narrow specific thing that the US government or, Five Eye partners are doing. I don't know how coherent that was, but, I just think it's a really complex problem. And I think we need serious actors who take it really seriously and also recognize that there is no one size fits all answer.
Can I add a little bit here? So I do believe that there are, there's technology that is important to the dominance of any military power that changes over time, right? And for example, I believe the ability to recognize whether or not a drone is ours and what is happening in the environment very quickly when the Russian military revs the drone every day and our existing detection capabilities do not support that. I think that's like a critical capability, right? And you could say the same of like, oh, we need to cover a large area in the Pacific to understand what is happening. Those are not general capabilities today, right? So like many of the techniques that people use, like language models and embeddings models, they are very relevant to these deployments. And in deployment, for example, in our companies that work with the Defense Department, like, the client determined like clearance policy, as mentioned, right? But I would say like the thing that I am most concerned about from a national security perspective is exactly the same, which is like, well, we can do it in America. We need it today. And like the procurement cycle is what it is. Right. I'm not trivializing the security issues at all, but I would say my understanding today is that like the deployment of it is quite specialized versus like the models themselves being some sort of universally powerful technology.
Yeah, I'll just throw in, we had UAVs in Vietnam and, did not really use them for a long time. So, yeah.
That was a mic drop moment. Sorry.
This is probably somewhat related, but as we think about kind of the trajectory of AI and self-improving AI that might eventually get towards what some people call or don't call AGI, how should we therefore think about the role of export controls?
Matt, you want to take that one?
Well, I'll throw some ideas out there. So, there's also the hardware software issue. So export controls are usually focused on hardware. They're not focused on fundamental knowledge. For one thing, there's a academic freedom and free speech issue there. But also the idea of sort of controlling software the way we might control a missile. I think the comparison isn't really going to serve us very well, right? I think when we talk,
I'm actually talking about hardware.
Yeah, you're talking about hardware. Okay, so you're not talking about AGI. You're just talking about having the scale of compute to run AGI.
Yes, but also the risk that if AGI is on the future or in the future, what do we need to be thinking about in terms of controls of hardware to give the United States an advantage?
Yeah, so to answer that question, I need you to be able to tell me what is hardware going to be able to do in 5 years? And what is the relationship between the hardware and AGI? And we do not know the answer to those questions. So, I think the thing about export controls is it's an entire regime developed for sort of a different issue set. And we are thinking through sort of the chips part of it, but it's just one piece of the puzzle. And I think there's a lot of really good, creative, thoughtful approaches to it in DC. So I don't mean to say, export control, like it's an important conversation to have, but I also think that we have to have a lot of humility. Everyone has to have a lot of humility about, what do we know about what a particular chip or a particular array of chips is going to be enabled, again, 2 to 5 years from now. The rate of change in the efficiency of these models is quite impressive and is also something that people around the world are working on. It's not something that we have a monopoly on here in the United States. And so I think we have to sort of add that to the equation as well. So that's why I'm not able to answer your question, because I don't think that we have the information we would need to answer it in a definitive way. And I also don't know that we know exactly what problem we're solving for when we're talking about that, in part because the term AGI itself is very ill-defined, which anyone in the field will tell you, right? It's sort of, every lab has kind of a different way they define it. And there aren't like really sort of standardized measures and indicators for it. So we're having sort of like, we're comparing two fuzzy things together and then trying to understand what the relationships to each other will be, and then trying to have a theory of causation in our policymaking. And that's just a tall order to give ourselves.
I think what he though is like probably one of the pain points that a lot of people in the room face is, you know, we're all living with these outdated frameworks and laws, right? And so, you know, part of it is like this, how do they go to, whether it's their members or their, you know, like, is it a transformational change on the set of rules and regulations? Because then that's a huge thing to really think through, and everybody needs to kind of be a part of thinking through what it looks like. Versus, are there incremental things? I think a lot of people in meetings are like, give me an incremental thing I can just do. Versus what you're saying, which it sounds like it's like, we don't know what the future is, but in this specific case, like, is it a full-on transformation around how we think about export controls? Not to speak for you, but just maybe to speak a little bit for you.
I think there's also the dimension of like, you need to make a prediction about what our competitors will do given export controls, right? And I think people have very different predictions about this. One view is if you do not give any GPUs of current and recent generations to competitors who are very committed to being competitive in AI, they will steal or make them, right? Very bluntly. I don't know, like, that is the job of policymakers and academics to study whether or not that is true, but I think you have to have a prediction on behavior in reaction to it to decide whether or not that helps us from a competitiveness perspective. I mean, somebody tell me if there's like a mainstream prediction on this, but I feel like it's very up for debate right now.
And then, yeah, go for it.
Hi, I'm Jasmine Crothers. I'm counsel for Senator Ruben Gallego. And I just wanted to kind of piggyback off his question, but given that there's so many unknowns and predictions, and I don't want to say we're speaking in hypotheticals, but we just don't know. So therefore, how should we be approaching, you know, policy and drafting legislation or staffing our members when we don't know what approach we should be taking?
Generally, or export controls specifically?
Generally.
Go ahead.
No, go
No,
ahead.
go ahead. I'll follow.
Yeah, so I think if we wipe this, this goes back to the thing that Alice said previously about focusing on harmful use versus focusing on development. I think we're in a weird spot where the debate, the range of proposals, the range of the majority proposals in AI policy to date have really been focused on what are a set of administrative things that you can do in the development process that might curb potential risks. I don't think that is the thing. If we were just blank slate right now, like if someone told us AI has been released in the world, you're really concerned that I'm going to develop a tool that's going to harm you, I don't think you would be saying, please publish a safety and security protocol. That's going to be the thing that's going to save me from your harmful use. I could lie on it. I could lie about it. It could be inaccurate. It's not going to capture all problematic uses. When I was at Facebook, we were part of the Global Network Initiative, which is a business and human rights organization. We signed up to a set of principles related to censorship and surveillance. And then we did an audit of those every 2 years, starting, I think, in 2014 or so. Since 2014, has Facebook had any issues related to censorship and surveillance? It is not. I think it is a beneficial. I think it is a non-zero positive tool. But I don't think it's the tool that if we said, let's just start from scratch, how should we protect ourselves? I think we would say strong criminal and civil laws that will, and this is what we do for everything, right? Strong criminal and civil laws to take action against perpetrators and to deter harmful activity. That, I think, is the primary focus. The response often is, so are you saying that bad things will just happen? That is the approach that we take to every other part of law. And if we said for something like murder, like the worst possible thing, I know a set of ways that we can go about preventing murder that involves intensive surveillance, a lot of ex-ante monitoring, trying to identify bad conduct before it occurs to stop the murder before it happens. Like, there's a film about that. It's called Minority Report. You know, it is a scary world that most people don't want to live in. And so at least for the short term, there are all these different areas of harmful use that I think we should be ensuring that we can enforce aggressively. And that's not the same. I think often when people say that, I don't know if you thought this when Alice said it, or if you're thinking it when I'm saying it, that like people think that means do nothing. But consumer protection law is not going to just enforce itself. Civil rights law is not going to just enforce itself. State and federal criminal law are not just going to enforce themselves. Those agencies need personnel, they need operational funding, they need technical understanding and capacity in order to do that work. And so I think there's really a lot of activity that needs to happen just to enforce existing law. And it might be that there are aspects of existing law that don't cover all categories of harmful use, and we may need to like think about new things in those areas. But I think focusing on use instead of just on development is a really productive direction to go in.
And I was just going to add to, I think Matt articulated it well, but I think we need to stop treating AI as one thing. It is not one thing. It is all about the context. It's all about the use cases. And I think a lot of policy making needs to happen within the context of use and understanding the impact, right? And then how you actually need to sort of steer this technology to get you the outcomes that you want. And I think one size doesn't fit all. So one of the things that we've been seeing in policy making is it's like, oh, let's come up with this set of regulation and apply to everything. That doesn't work. And so I would say that starting with don't treat as one thing, but really thinking about the context of use is the best way to go.
Maybe one addition here, and this goes back to like, what is the role of academia? Like, I think most people here are working on AI or the intersection of AI and society because they think it will be useful, right? And like regulation and policymakers, they need to do defense, but they also like, I think there's a real opportunity to play offense here. Right? If we think about the like productivity of the American worker, I do not think that they will become more globally competitive because we compete with Vietnam for $3 an hour jobs, right? Like there's an opportunity to create an American manufacturing industry that is globally competitive because somebody is making $20 an hour and producing much, much more with robotics, for example. And so I don't think a lot of the applications that are positive and productivity oriented are being studied today. And if they were better understood, you could also go on the offense in terms of like enabling them with better policy.
Thank you so much for being here and talking to us. You know, my question's a bit of a nested Russian doll, but I hope that doesn't bring us too far away from a Tuesday or a Friday panel like you want it to be. I'm Jake Easter. I'm an education policy advisor in the Senate Help Committee, and I'm interested in kind of zooming into this AI adoption and diffusion question that we touched on. I think that's like really a huge problem that we need to focus on. And I'm just curious, you know, from the panel's perspective, like what major headwinds does like AI, does the AI industry and stack face in terms of getting enough adoption to kind of reap the benefits? Because it's clear sort of right now we're like, we've invested a whole lot. We got a lot of great players in the space that are doing great things, but we haven't quite seen like, you know, all of the benefits yet. And is trust like in the validity of this technology, like one of those headwinds and getting people to trust it? And if so, like, is there some threshold of like aggregate trust that gets us to that point that we want of adoption? Or is there anything that we can do to move that needle?
Navrina, do you have any thoughts?
Lots of thoughts on that. So we will make it to Friday at that rate. So, you know, I don't know if you read the AI action plan. I think one of the great things that the AI action plan did was on page 5. It's one of my favorite paragraphs there. And it says it's not the dearth of technology or models, it's actually the lack of trust and governance that is going to basically be a big barrier to this technology. And again, I keep going back to the message, which might seem very repetitive, but how you're going to measure these systems, I don't think there's going to be a baseline of this is trustworthy or not. It's going to be, again, context dependent. So, you know, we were very excited to hear about some of the things in the action plan around robust evaluations, around metrics that you need to be measuring, because a big part of that is really translating into, can I trust this technology? Prior to starting CredoAI, I was with Microsoft for a long time. I was heading their conversational AI systems, and we launched this amazing bot, which obviously was in healthcare, it was in financial services, but it was also the bot that was launched on Twitter, and it went from 0 to racist in less than 16 hours, right? So I think the key question there was, were we able to do actually effective evaluation of what would trust with consumer mean? It goes back to the context of use. So I am actually really heartened to see some of the focus on trust and how do you actually, using scientific basis, empirical methods, be able to measure that, but also how do we actually bridge the gap between, a very core technical metric, let's say toxicity or adversarial robustness, but translate it for a policymaker, a non-AI expert. I think that's where massive innovation is needed.
Well, with that, there is a time paper. So we have to wrap because there is a great reception ahead of us. Thank you to our panelists and everyone. Just give a nice round of applause. And they'll be physically up here like right now. So this is the time. If you have any questions, I'm sure they have to go places to be, but they're right here right now. So anyways, we'll let you guys break and then there'll be a reception out in that way.
Thank you.
That way.
Thank you.
Somewhere. Yes, great.
Good job.